The alien queen found the letter I wrote for her and turned to me saying, "So you want to marry me?" Jackson had never considered himself particularly ambitious, which made his current position as royal scribe to an alien queen somewhat ironic. He'd applied mostly because the advertisement promised room and board included, and his landlord had been making creative threats about overdue rent. The fact that the position required relocating to an entirely different planet seemed like a minor detail at the time. Now standing in the crystalline hallway of the palace, watching walls pulse with soft blue light from some energy source he couldn't begin to comprehend, Jackson wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The palace major domo, a severe woman named Mira, who looked human enough, except for the faint iridescence of her skin, led him through corridors that seemed to shift subtly when he wasn't looking directly at them. "The quantum architecture takes some getting used to," she said, noticing his disorientation. "Try not to think about it too hard. Last scribe gave himself migraines for a week." "What happened to the last scribe?" Jackson asked, immediately regretting the question. "Promoted. Stop worrying." Mira's expression softened slightly. "You'll do fine. Probably. The council chamber is through here." The doors opened without anyone touching them, which Jackson supposed he should start getting used to. The chamber beyond took his breath away. Curved walls rose toward a domed ceiling embedded with what looked like actual stars, though he suspected they were some form of advanced holographic projection. The air hummed with a frequency he felt in his bones rather than heard. And there, seated upon a throne that appeared carved from frozen starlight, was Queen Nova. Jackson had seen images during the application process, but they hadn't prepared him for the reality. Her skin held an almost luminescent quality, as if moonlight had decided to take physical form. Her hair, dark as the space between stars, cascaded over shoulders draped in fabrics that shimmered with colors he was fairly certain didn't exist in normal human perception. But it was her ears that truly marked her as other. Long and gracefully pointed, adorned with delicate silver rings that caught the light with each slight movement of her head. She was, Jackson realized with creeping horror, the most beautiful being he'd ever seen. "The new scribe, Your Majesty," Mira announced. Jackson attempted what he hoped was an appropriate bow. He'd practiced in his quarters that morning, but suddenly couldn't remember if he was supposed to go down on one knee or two, or possibly just nod respectfully, and ended up doing an awkward combination of all three that made his knee crack audibly. Several council members tried unsuccessfully to hide their amusement. Nova's eyes, pale and sharp as winter stars, fixed on him with an expression he couldn't read. "Rise," she said, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place, something that suggested languages far older than his own. Jackson stood, wobbled slightly, and made his way to the scribe's desk positioned to the right of the throne. Someone had helpfully laid out parchment, several quills, and what appeared to be an ink pot, though the liquid inside shifted colors like oil on water. "We're finalizing a trade agreement with the Viridian Collective," Nova continued, returning her attention to the gathered diplomats. "Article 7, Subsection 3 requires clarification regarding tariff schedules." Jackson dipped his quill, positioned it over the parchment, and immediately discovered that alien ink had very different properties than what he was used to. The first stroke splattered spectacularly, sending droplets across the page in what would have made an interesting abstract painting, but was decidedly unprofessional documentation. Several more droplets landed on his shirt. One reached the floor. In the sudden silence, Jackson heard that droplet hit the marble with a sound like a tiny bell. Nova's gaze shifted to him again. Her ears twitched almost imperceptibly. Her mouth curved at one corner in what might have been amusement, though her voice remained perfectly neutral. "Perhaps the scribe requires a moment to familiarize himself with the equipment." "No, Your Majesty, I'm fine, completely fine," Jackson said, frantically trying to blot the worst of the damage. He succeeded only in smearing ink across his palm. "Ready to proceed. Very ready. Extremely prepared for subsection 3. He was definitely going to be fired before lunch." But Nova simply nodded and continued the discussion. Something about quantum-locked shipping containers and temporal customs checkpoints that went entirely over Jackson's head. He focused on transcribing words, trying to ignore the way his hand trembled slightly, trying very hard not to look at the throne where she sat with perfect posture, commanding the room with casual authority. By the time the session ended 2 hours later, Jackson had managed to produce a document that was only mostly illegible. He'd also developed a cramp in his writing hand and a growing suspicion that he'd accidentally documented several clauses completely backward. As the council members filed out, Mira appeared at his elbow. "Not your finest work," she observed, glancing at the parchment. "I'm aware. But you didn't faint or flee, which puts you ahead of 3 previous candidates." She handed him a cloth for his ink-stained fingers. "The gardens are nice this time of evening. Good for clearing your head." Jackson took the suggestion gratefully. He needed air, perspective, and possibly a strong drink. The palace gardens existed in defiance of everything he knew about horticulture. Flowers bloomed in colors that hurt to look at directly, their petals releasing bioluminescent pollen that drifted upward instead of down. Trees grew in impossible spirals, their leaves chiming softly in wind that seemed to come from no particular direction. In the distance, he could see the city spreading out beneath the palace, buildings connected by streams of light that flowed like rivers through the air. He'd traveled across the galaxy to work for a queen whose beauty made his chest ache, in a palace that operated on principles he didn't understand, documenting treaties for species he'd never heard of. Jackson sat on a bench that adjusted itself to his weight and dropped his head into his hands. This was either going to be the best decision of his life or the most catastrophically stupid. Possibly both. 3 weeks into his employment, Jackson had developed a working theory that the universe had a sense of humor, and he was the punchline. He'd managed to transcribe an entire diplomatic accord upside down, requiring a midnight session with Mira to recreate it before the Andorian ambassador noticed. He'd accidentally activated what he thought was a decorative lamp, which turned out to be an emergency distress beacon that summoned a military frigate from orbit. And just yesterday, he'd somehow dated a document as the 34th of June, a month that didn't exist on any known calendar system. "You're improving," Mira said, setting down a plate of something that looked like pastries, but shimmered faintly in the morning light. "Last week you would have dated it the 37th. Jackson accepted the food gratefully. He'd learned not to ask too many questions about what he was eating. Everything tasted vaguely like cinnamon and starlight anyway. "I'm a consummate professional. You spelled sovereignty with a W in yesterday's treaty draft. A silent W. Very advanced linguistic choice." Mira's laugh echoed off the crystalline walls of the staff dining hall. She'd warmed to him considerably after he'd helped her reprogram a malfunctioning serving bot that kept trying to serve drinks to potted plants. Other staff members had followed her lead, and Jackson found himself part of a strange family of beings from a dozen different worlds, all keeping the palace running, while nobles argued about things like temporal trade rights and interdimensional shipping lanes. "Council session in an hour," Mira reminded him. "Economics summit. Try to stay awake this time." "I was awake during the last one." Your gentle snoring suggested otherwise. Jackson had no defense for that. Economic summaries delivered in monotone by the treasurer of fiscal oversight could put a caffeinated insomniac into a coma. He gathered his materials and made his way to the council chamber, nodding to guards whose armor seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. The morning session proved Mira's warning accurate, an endless parade of charts, graphs, and projections that apparently required quantum computers to fully comprehend. Jackson transcribed dutifully, his mind wandering to the breakfast pastries, to the strange bird-like creatures he'd seen in the gardens, to anything except the current discussion of trade deficits in the Outer Rim territories. Nova sat perfectly still on her throne, her attention seemingly absolute. But Jackson had been watching her for weeks now, cataloging details he had no business noticing. He saw the way her long ears twitched slightly when the treasurer hit a particularly tedious subsection. He caught the moment her eyes glazed over during an explanation of compound interest rates across 3 different temporal zones. And then, for just a fraction of a second, she yawned. It was so quick, so carefully hidden behind one hand, that Jackson was certain no one else noticed. But he did, and something about seeing that tiny crack in her regal composure made his heart do an uncomfortable flip in his chest. She was bored. Queen Nova, ruler of a planet, master diplomat, the woman who'd negotiated peace treaties with species that communicated through aggressive posturing and ritual combat, was bored senseless by budget allocations. Jackson bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. The session dragged on. The treasurer moved to three-dimensional projections that rotated in midair, showing economic models that looked like abstract art. Jackson was contemplating whether anyone would notice if he stabbed himself with his quill just to feel something when the palace itself interrupted. A low hum built in the walls. The holographic projections flickered, and then, with a sensation like reality hiccuping, everyone in the council chamber began to float. Gravity, Jackson realized with detached horror, had apparently decided to take a break. The Andorian ambassadors shrieked, their tentacles flailing as they drifted toward the ceiling. The treasurer grabbed desperately at their floating charts. One council member, a dignified elderly man from the Northern Territories, rotated slowly while making sounds that suggested he was reconsidering his career choices. Jackson, lacking any kind of personal stabilization technology, found himself rising inexorably upward. He grabbed at a curtain, missed, and ended up doing a graceless tumble that left him hanging upside down from a decorative sconce. Nova naturally remained perfectly composed. She touched something on the silver cuff at her wrist, and while everyone else flailed and panicked, she simply stopped floating. Hung there in midair with the same regal bearing she displayed on her throne, as if defying gravity was just another Tuesday. "The stabilizers appear to be malfunctioning," she observed, her voice calm. "This session will continue. The treasurer may proceed with the quarterly projections." The treasurer, clutching a chandelier with both hands and looking faintly green, made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been suppressed nausea. Jackson tried to orient himself, failed, and ended up with his legs tangled in the curtain, while his quill and parchment floated serenely past his face. He made a grab for them and succeeded only in sending himself into a slow spin. From her position of perfect stability, Nova's eyes found him. Her ears twitched, and Jackson could absolutely swear, he saw her lips curve in genuine amusement. "Someone fetch maintenance," she said, "and perhaps a ladder for the scribe." 20 mortifying minutes later, after Mira had rescued him with an extendable maintenance ladder and gravity had been convinced to return to normal functionality, Jackson found himself back at his desk. His notes were scattered across 3 different levels of the chamber. His hair stood up in directions that suggested he'd been struck by lightning. His dignity, never particularly robust, had left the building entirely. The session resumed. Nova continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. The treasurer, still looking slightly ill, returned to budget projections, and Jackson, carefully reorganizing his scattered parchments, heard it. Soft, quickly stifled, but unmistakable. Nova was laughing. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds before she composed herself, her expression returning to diplomatic neutrality. But Jackson had heard it, that genuine sound of mirth, and something warm and entirely inadvisable bloomed in his chest. He was in so much trouble, the kind of trouble that didn't involve malfunctioning gravity or backwards treaties, but something far more dangerous, the kind that started with noticing the way starlight caught in someone's eyes and ended with a scribe's heart doing something phenomenally stupid. Jackson dipped his quill in the color-shifting ink and tried to focus on transcription. He failed miserably. The palace AI had a name, though Jackson hadn't learned it until his 2nd month of employment. Area, which stood for something complicated involving adaptive and intelligence, and several other words that went over his head. What mattered was that Nova spoke to the system like an old friend, her voice softening in a way it never did with the council members or visiting dignitaries. Jackson noticed this during a late afternoon session when a holographic malfunction caused the star map to display everything in reverse. While technicians scrambled, Nova simply said, "Area, the projection is inverted again," with the kind of gentle exasperation one might use with a beloved but slightly confused grandparent. "Apologies, Your Majesty," the AI's voice responded, warm and faintly amused. "My spatial processing subroutines are feeling somewhat turned around today. Perhaps you need recalibration. Perhaps I'm simply keeping things interesting." Nova's lips curved in a smile that made Jackson's quill pause mid-stroke. He'd been cataloging these moments without meaning to, collecting them like someone gathering forbidden treasure. The way she absently touched the silver cuff on her wrist when faced with a difficult decision, the small crease that appeared between her brows when she was thinking hard about something, the precise angle her ears shifted when she was listening to someone lie. A tell so subtle he was certain she didn't realize she had it. He knew things about her he had no right knowing. That she took her tea too hot and drank it too fast. That she read economic reports before bed, often falling asleep with them scattered across her desk. That she'd ruled for 40 years. Though she looked barely older than Jackson himself, some quirk of her biology that made time move differently for her people. Mira had told him the history over lunch one day, unprompted. How Nova had inherited a broken world at 20, her planet devastated by a war with the Syndicate territories. How she'd rebuilt through brilliant diplomacy and ruthless pragmatism, securing membership in the Galactic Consortium and pulling her people back from the edge of extinction. How she'd done it all alone, unmarried by choice, wedded only to duty. She could have anyone she wanted, Mira had said, studying Jackson with knowing eyes. But power is lonely. Hard to trust someone when you're never sure if they want you or your crown. Jackson had changed the subject quickly, but the words haunted him during sleepless nights in his quarters. He started volunteering for extra work. Transcription that didn't need immediate attention. Archival projects that kept him in the palace library until the small hours. Anything that put him in proximity to her, even if they rarely spoke directly. He was pathetic and he knew it, but knowing didn't make him stop. During a reception for an ambassador whose species communicated primarily through interpretive dance, Jackson made his most spectacular mistake yet. The ceremonial torch he'd been asked to hold, not understanding it was purely decorative and not meant to be moved, caught on his jacket sleeve when he attempted to bow. The fabric ignited with enthusiasm that suggested it had been waiting for this opportunity. Jackson yelped, dropped the torch, and tried to pat out the flames with his free hand, which only fanned them higher. An alarmed diplomat made sounds that probably translated to suggestions. He stop, drop, and roll. Someone else attempted to help but ended up tangling them both in a decorative banner. Nova moved with decisive efficiency. She grabbed the nearest beverage, crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and doused both Jackson and the banner in what smelled like very expensive wine. The flames died. Jackson stood there, dripping, mortified, and acutely aware that half the diplomatic corps was staring at him. Perhaps the scribe should avoid open flames in future, Nova said, her voice perfectly level. But her eyes held something that might have been laughter, and her mouth twitched at the corner in a way that made Jackson want to sink through the floor. "Sound policy, Your Majesty," he managed. She handed him a cloth that appeared from somewhere, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Her skin was warm, warmer than he'd expected, and the contact lasted perhaps half a second, but Jackson felt it in his chest like an electrical current. "You should change," she said quietly, and turned back to the reception, as if setting scribes on fire was simply part of her evening routine. Jackson fled to his quarters, stripped off the wine-soaked jacket, and sat on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands. This was unsustainable. This constant awareness of her, this cataloging of details, this ache that built every time she smiled at something Arya said or showed unexpected gentleness to the maintenance staff who kept the palace running. He was a scribe from a farming colony whose greatest achievement before this had been winning a regional spelling competition at age 12. She was a queen who negotiated with beings that had mastered quantum mechanics and traveled between dimensions. The distance between them might as well have been measured in light years. He knew this, understood it with perfect clarity, but knowledge didn't stop him from noticing that she mispronounced certain words from his colony's dialect in a way that was endearing rather than wrong. Didn't prevent him from watching how she moved through the palace, commanding respect without ever raising her voice. Didn't keep his traitorous heart from doing complicated acrobatics every time those pale eyes found him across a crowded room. Jackson changed into clean clothes and returned to his duties. The reception continued. Nova spoke with the dancing ambassador with perfect diplomatic grace, her long ears catching the light, her posture immaculate. And Jackson transcribed, documented, and very carefully did not think about the way her fingers had felt against his, or the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, dripping and ridiculous with what might have been fondness. He was absolutely, catastrophically doomed, and there wasn't a single thing he could do about it except keep showing up, keep making mistakes, and keep pretending his heart wasn't performing feats of gymnastics every time she entered a room. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday, which Jackson thought was appropriate because nothing good ever happened on Tuesdays. The Andorian collective, responsible for approximately 40% of the sector's agricultural exports, announced their intention to withdraw from the trade consortium. Their reasons were complex, involving tariff disputes and territorial disagreements that had been simmering for months. The consequences were simple: economic collapse across 7 systems, potential food shortages, and the very real possibility of renewed conflict. Nova Zhao Ji Liao Jinji Huiyi. The emergency sessions began immediately. Council members arrived at all hours, their faces grim. Holographic displays showed supply chain projections that looked like abstract representations of disaster. The palace, usually humming with quiet efficiency, took on the frantic energy of controlled panic. Jackson found himself working 16-hour days, documenting negotiations that stretched past midnight. He watched Nova operate on what had to be less than 3 hours of sleep, sustained by stimulants that made her eyes too bright and her movements too precise. She negotiated with Andorian representatives who appeared via quantum-linked projections, their forms flickering slightly at the edges of reality. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders in ways Jackson could see but felt powerless to address. What could he possibly offer? He was a scribe who still occasionally misspelled basic diplomatic terminology. She was managing the potential destabilization of an entire sector. On the 4th night of crisis talks, Jackson worked alone in the archive room, cross-referencing treaty precedents that might provide legal framework for a compromise. His eyes burned. His hand cramped around the quill. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, he'd stopped being able to tell if the words he was reading made sense or if exhaustion had turned them into abstract symbols. The door opened without warning. Nova stood in the doorway, and Jackson's first thought was that she looked like she might collapse at any moment. Her usual luminescence had dimmed to something fragile. Her ears drooped slightly, a detail he'd never seen before. She carried a data tablet in one hand and what appeared to be the weight of several worlds on her shoulders. "Your Majesty," Jackson stood quickly, nearly knocking over his inkpot in the process. "I didn't expect. Is there something you need?" "The 2247 accord with the Viridian territories," she said. "Article 12 had a clause about agricultural trade disputes. I can't remember the exact wording." Jackson pulled the relevant treaty from the shelves, his fingers finding it automatically after months of organizing documents. He brought it to the reading table where Nova had already sat down, her posture suggesting she might not get back up without significant effort. "Here," he said, pointing to the section. "Subsection 4 addresses mediation protocols for commodity disagreements." Nova leaned forward, studying the text with an intensity that suggested she was forcing her exhausted brain to process information it no longer wanted to hold. Jackson noticed her hands trembling slightly against the parchment. "You should rest," he said before his brain could stop his mouth. "Your Majesty," he added belatedly. She looked up at him, and something in her expression was so raw, so stripped of the diplomatic mask she wore, that Jackson's heart clenched painfully in his chest. "If I rest, people starve," she said simply. 7 systems worth of people who trusted me to keep them safe. Jackson did something incredibly stupid. He went to the small beverage station the archivist maintained, found the tea from his homeworld that he'd brought months ago, and prepared it the way his mother had taught him. Nothing fancy, no alien technology, just hot water and leaves and thyme. He set the cup in front of Nova without ceremony. She stared at it as if he'd presented her with something incomprehensible. "What is this?" "Tea, from my colony. It won't solve the Andorian situation, but it's warm and it might help you think more clearly." He hesitated. "My mother always said that sometimes you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of anyone else." Nova lifted the cup with both hands, inhaled the steam, and took a careful sip. Her eyes closed briefly. "It's good. It's simple, but sometimes simple helps." They sat in silence while she drank. Jackson returned to his treaty research, giving her space but remaining present, a quiet companion in the long night. He noticed how her shoulders gradually relaxed, how the trembling in her hands stilled. "Tell me about your colony," she said suddenly. "What was it like before you came here?" Jackson blinked at the unexpected request. "It was small, quiet. We grew apples mostly, some pears. My family's orchard was nothing special, but the trees were old and the fruit was reliable." He smiled at the memory. The sky at night was overwhelming. No light pollution, no city glow. Just stars everywhere. So many you couldn't count them, even if you tried your whole life. Nova listened with an attention that made his simple words feel important, as if the story of a farming colony scribe mattered as much as trade negotiations and diplomatic protocols. "It sounds peaceful," she said. "It was. Is. I miss it sometimes." Jackson surprised himself with the honesty. "But I wouldn't trade this for anything." Her eyes found his, pale and searching, and Jackson realized too late what he'd revealed in that statement. Not the palace, not the position. These moments. Her. "The Andorians respond better to personal appeals than legal frameworks," Nova said quietly, returning to the crisis as if the moment hadn't happened. "They value individual honor over institutional obligation. If I can convince their matriarch that withdrawal would be personally dishonorable rather than just economically inadvisable." She was thinking aloud, working through the problem, and Jackson recognized the shift in her expression that meant pieces were falling into place in that brilliant mind. "Article 12 could support that approach," he offered. "The mediation protocols emphasize individual representative accountability." Nova's smile, when it came, was genuine and unguarded and completely devastating. "Yes, exactly that." She finished her tea, stood with renewed energy, and paused at the door. "Thank you, Jackson." It was the first time she'd used his name directly, and hearing it in her voice did something catastrophic to his internal organs. "Anytime, Your Majesty." She left, taking her data tablet and her renewed determination, leaving Jackson alone with the treaties and his hopelessly compromised heart. 3 days later, Nova brokered a compromise that saved the trade agreement. Jackson watched from his scribe's desk as she negotiated the final terms with the Andorian matriarch, speaking of honor and mutual obligation with such conviction that even the hardened council members looked moved. When it was done, when the signatures were recorded and the crisis averted, Nova allowed herself a smile that reached her eyes. A real smile, unguarded and bright, and Jackson's heart didn't stand a chance. That night, alone in his quarters while the palace celebrated, he found himself with parchment and quill and feelings that had nowhere else to go. He began to write. The words came out in a torrent, his quill moving faster than conscious thought could supervise. Jackson wrote about the first time he'd seen her, how the morning light had caught in her hair, and he'd known immediately that his life had just become considerably more complicated. He wrote about the gravity malfunction, about setting himself on fire, about every mortifying moment that should have convinced him to maintain proper professional distance, but had somehow done the opposite. He wrote about her strength during the Andorian crisis, the weight she carried without complaint, the way she sat in the archive room drinking tea as if his simple gesture had mattered. He wrote about how she spoke to Arya with such gentleness, how her ears twitched when diplomats lied, how she mispronounced words from his colony's dialect in a way that made him want to listen to her talk forever. He confessed that he saw her loneliness, recognized it because it mirrored something in himself. That behind the crown and the diplomatic brilliance, he glimpsed someone who'd forgotten what it meant to be seen as just herself. He wrote that he knew this was impossible, that the distance between scribe and queen might as well span galaxies, but that witnessing her existence had fundamentally altered something in him that couldn't be unaltered. The letter grew longer than any treaty he'd ever transcribed. By the time Jackson finally set down his quill, the bioluminescent flowers outside his window had begun their evening glow, painting his quarters in shades of blue and violet that didn't exist naturally on his homeworld. He read it over once, his heart hammering against his ribs with each sentence. It was too honest, too raw, too everything. The kind of confession that could end careers and ruin lives, and generally demonstrated why scribes should stick to documenting other people's important words rather than generating their own. Jackson sealed the parchment with hands that trembled slightly. He had no intention of sending it, of course. This was just catharsis, a way to externalize feelings that had been building pressure in his chest for months. He would keep it in his desk drawer, a private record of temporary insanity brought on by proximity to someone extraordinary. He tucked the letter beneath a stack of blank parchment in practice drafts, secure in the knowledge that no one would ever read his humiliating outpouring of inappropriate emotion. Jackson went to bed, slept poorly, and woke to morning light filtering through his window with a particular quality that suggested he was late for something. He dressed quickly, grabbed his materials, and was halfway to the council chamber when a terrible thought stopped him mid-stride. The letter. He'd left it in an unsecured drawer. The Palace AI monitored everything for security purposes. Everything. Energy fluctuations, unauthorized communications, potential threats to the crown. Jackson had signed approximately 40 documents acknowledging this when he'd accepted the position, though he'd been too focused on the room and board included part to fully process the implications. Area would have scanned his quarters last night, would have flagged unusual activity, would have detected emotional content beyond normal parameters in a document that mentioned the Queen by name repeatedly. Jackson's blood went cold. He ran back to his quarters, his materials forgotten, propriety abandoned in favor of sheer panic. He burst through the door, crossed to his desk in 3 strides, yanked open the drawer with enough force to send its contents scattering across the floor. The letter was gone, just gone, as if it had never existed. The blank parchment remained. The practice drafts lay exactly where he'd left them, but the sealed letter containing every foolish feeling he'd ever had about Queen Nova had vanished completely. "No," Jackson said aloud to his empty quarters. "No, no, absolutely not." He searched the floor, the desk, under the furniture, in places the letter couldn't possibly have migrated on its own. Nothing. The palace had taken it, processed it through whatever security protocols governed potentially suspicious documents, and presumably delivered it to someone for review. Someone being, in all likelihood, the person the letter was about. Jackson sat down hard on his bed, his mind racing through catastrophic scenarios. Immediate dismissal, imprisonment for inappropriate conduct toward royalty, deportation back to his colony where he'd spend the rest of his life known as that idiot who fell in love with an alien queen and was stupid enough to write it down. He could run, pack his few belongings, find a transport off-world, disappear into the outer colonies where no one knew his name or his spectacular failure of judgment. But running meant never knowing, meant living forever with the coward's exit, the unanswered question hanging over every moment of whatever life he built somewhere else. And despite everything, despite the panic and mortification and certainty of professional ruin, Jackson found he couldn't do that to her. Nova deserved better than having someone flee without explanation, adding another person to the list of those who'd left her alone with the weight of the crown. He stood, straightened his jacket, and forced his breathing into something approximating normal. If he was going to be fired, imprisoned, or otherwise destroyed, he'd face it directly. He owed her that much. The walk to the throne room felt approximately 10,000 miles long. Guards nodded to him, oblivious to his internal catastrophe. The palace hummed with its usual morning energy. Business as usual, while Jackson's world ended in slow motion. The throne room doors opened silently at his approach. Morning light streamed through the crystalline walls, painting everything in shades of gold and white that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The room was empty except for one figure standing by the window, backlit by the rising sun. Nova held a piece of parchment in her fingers, the wax seal broken, and Jackson's handwriting was visible even from across the room. She turned as he entered, and her expression was completely unreadable, the diplomatic mask firmly in place, giving nothing away. Jackson's heart stopped, restarted, and briefly considered stopping again for good measure. Nova looked down at the letter, then back at him, her pale eyes steady and searching. "So you want to marry me," she said, and the question hung in the air between them like a held breath, like the moment before gravity decides which way to pull, like every impossible thing Jackson had ever wanted, suddenly balanced on the edge of maybe. Time stopped being a reliable concept. Jackson stood frozen in the doorway while his brain attempted to process the question that had just rearranged his entire understanding of reality. His mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing any sounds that qualified as language. I can explain, he finally managed, which was possibly the worst opening to any conversation in recorded history. Actually, no, I can't explain. There's no reasonable explanation for any of this except temporary insanity brought on by prolonged exposure to someone who shouldn't be allowed to exist because it's fundamentally unfair to everyone else's cardiovascular systems. Nova's ears twitched, a movement Jackson had learned to recognize as suppressed amusement. That's quite a medical theory. I should resign immediately, Jackson continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. I'll pack my things, find the next transport to literally anywhere else, and you can forget this ever happened. I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. I never meant for you to see that. I never meant to write it in the first place. I definitely never meant to. Jackson? She cut through his spiral with a single word, his name spoken in that accent that had haunted his dreams for months. Stop apologizing and answer the question. Did you mean what you wrote? Every survival instinct Jackson possessed screamed at him to lie, to backtrack, to salvage whatever remained of his dignity and career. But he looked at her standing there in the morning light, holding his catastrophically honest letter, and found he couldn't add dishonesty to his list of mistakes. Yes, he said quietly, every word, which is why I should really leave before this gets any more mortifying for both of us. Area flagged unusual emotional content in a document originating from your quarters, Nova said, her voice carefully neutral. Security protocols require review of anything that mentions the Crown directly. I accessed the file against my better judgment. I understand. I read it 3 times. Jackson's brain stuttered to a halt. I'm sorry, what? Nova set the letter down on a nearby table, her fingers lingering on the parchment for a moment before she turned to face him fully. The first time was shock. The second was attempting to determine if I'd misunderstood something. The third was... She paused, and for the first time since he had entered the room, her diplomatic mask slipped slightly. The third was wondering if perhaps I'd been equally foolish without realizing it. I don't understand. You think I didn't notice you? Her voice carried something between amusement and exasperation. You who somehow manages to set yourself on fire at diplomatic receptions and transcribe treaties upside down? You who brings me tea from your homeworld like it's the most natural thing to offer a queen? You who looks at me like I'm a person rather than a political necessity? Jackson's heart was doing acrobatics that should require safety equipment. I thought I was being subtle. You knocked over your ink pot the first time you saw me. You spent 2 months volunteering for extra work that just happened to keep you in the palace until unreasonable hours. You learned to predict when I was lying to diplomats because you watched my ears. Nova's expression softened into something genuine and slightly nervous. I noticed, Jackson. I've been noticing for quite some time. But you're... He gestured helplessly at her, at the throne room, at the fundamental impossibility of the situation. You're you, and I'm someone who recently had to be rescued from a chandelier by the maintenance staff. Yes, that was memorable. The corner of her mouth curved upward. Area has it recorded for posterity. I've watched it 7 times. That's mortifying. That's honest. Nova moved closer, and Jackson's brain went offline entirely. Do you know what 40 years of ruling teaches you? How to read people. How to see through flattery and political maneuvering. How to recognize when someone wants your crown versus when someone wants... She stopped, seeming to choose her words carefully. When someone sees past the crown entirely. I see you, Jackson said, the words coming out more intensely than intended. I see someone who falls asleep reading economic reports and speaks to the palace AI like a friend. Someone who negotiated peace while running on 3 hours of sleep and stimulants. Someone who's so busy taking care of everyone else that she forgets to take care of herself. Someone who's been alone for so long that she'd convinced herself it was easier that way, Nova said quietly, until a scribe from a farming colony appeared in her throne room, knocked over his ink pot, and proceeded to be genuinely, catastrophically himself without any agenda whatsoever. They stood close enough now that Jackson could see the faint circles beneath her eyes, evidence of too many late nights and too much responsibility. Could see the way her hands trembled slightly, nerves matching his own. The letter asked if I wanted to marry you, she continued. That's somewhat accelerated, even by diplomatic standards. Jackson felt heat flood his face. That was hyperbole, emotional exaggeration. I didn't literally mean, I'm aware, but it did make me think about what I do want. Nova's voice dropped lower, almost uncertain. I want to have dinner with someone who brings me tea without being asked. I want conversations that aren't about trade agreements or political strategy. I want... She paused, and when she met his eyes, Jackson saw vulnerability there that matched his own. I want to see if this impossible thing might be possible after all. Dinner, Jackson repeated, his brain struggling to keep up. You want to have dinner with me? Unless you'd prefer to skip directly to marriage proposals. No, dinner is considerably more sensible. Jackson laughed, a sound caught somewhere between disbelief and joy. Though I should warn you that I'm terrible at dinner. I'll probably knock something over or set the tablecloth on fire or accidentally insult your ancestors. I'm counting on it. Nova smiled, genuine and bright, and Jackson's heart performed a final spectacular flip before surrendering entirely. Tomorrow evening, my private quarters. Nothing formal, nothing diplomatic, just dinner between two people who are both probably making terrible decisions, but might be willing to make them together. I'd like that, Jackson said. I'd really catastrophically like that. She reached out, placed the letter in his hands, their fingers brushing in a way that sent electricity up his spine. Keep this. You write better than you think. I spelled sovereignty with a W in yesterday's treaty. A silent W, very avant-garde. Jackson left the throne room in a daze, the letter clutched in hands that still trembled slightly. The palace continued its morning routine around him, oblivious to the fact that reality had just rearranged itself into something new and terrifying and wonderful. Mira found him in the hallway, staring at nothing with what was probably an idiotic expression. You look like you've seen a ghost, she observed. Worse, Jackson said. I think I have a date with the Queen. Mira's laugh echoed off the crystalline walls. About time. The betting pool was getting ridiculous. There's a betting pool? Everyone saw this coming except you two. She patted his shoulder. Try not to set yourself on fire tomorrow, or do. She seems to find it endearing. Jackson returned to his quarters, placed the letter carefully in his desk drawer, properly secured this time, and looked out at the palace gardens where bioluminescent flowers bloomed in impossible colors. The same gardens he'd sat in months ago, overwhelmed and uncertain, convinced he'd made either the best or worst decision of his life. Both, he thought now. Definitely both. Somewhere in the palace, Nova was probably returning to council sessions and diplomatic obligations, that mask of regal composure back in place. But tomorrow evening, maybe that mask could come down. Maybe two people who'd been alone too long could figure out how to be less alone together. Jackson had traveled across the galaxy for a job that promised room and board. He'd stumbled into the throne room with ink-stained fingers and catastrophically poor first impressions. He'd made every mistake possible and several that were probably unprecedented in royal court history. And somehow, impossibly, he'd ended up exactly where he needed to be. The stars beyond his window had never looked brighter. Years later, when people asked Jackson how he won a queen's heart, he would smile and tell them the truth. He hadn't won anything. He had simply been himself, flawed, clumsy, disastrously honest, and had found someone who valued that more than perfection. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do isn't slaying dragons or conquering kingdoms. Sometimes it's admitting that we're afraid, that we're unsure, that we feel things we don't have a rational reason for. Sometimes it's coming out with trembling hands and a heart full of impossible hope, believing that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the strongest foundation we can build upon. Nova taught him that distance, whether measured by social status or light years, only matters when we allow it. That loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about hiding our truth from those around us, and that the impossible becomes possible the moment two people stop protecting themselves and decide to choose each other. The real question isn't whether you're worthy of love. It's about whether you have the courage to be honest about who you are and how you feel, even when logic screams you'll be rejected, even if the stakes seem astronomical, even if you're just a clerk standing before someone seemingly unattainable with ink-stained fingers. What was that impossible thing you didn't dare reach for? What was the truth you hid in a drawer, convinced no one should ever see it? And what might change if you dared to show it? The end. We've reached the end of our story. You can share your thoughts on the story in the comments below. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Pulse for more stories exploring the human heart across galaxies, and click the like button if Jackson's journey made you believe in impossible possibilities. See you in our next story. Until